Ukrainian border guards from the Askell unit, along with the Stolavy and Kordon brigades, discovered the location of Russian troops in the northern Slobozhanщina direction. With the help of strike drones, Ukrainian pilots managed to hit a tank, 2 antennas, a vehicle, and a Russian military drone.
In the second week of February, Russian losses increased by about 40 to 50%. And today, they amount to every square kilometer of Ukrainian land, that's about 210 occupiers. So we see that just a few days ago, the president of Ukraine said it was around 170 people. Russians are paying with their lives for every square kilometer. But in the second week of February, as you can see, these numbers increased. The work of strike drones, yes, that's absolutely right, Ukrainian ones, has now returned to the levels we saw some time ago.
The city of Kupyansk in the Kharkiv region is under the control of Ukrainian forces. Russian units are holding only a few buildings and are unable to conduct active operations. The remaining Russian occupiers in the city, armed with light weapons and UAVs, are holding a circular defense inside buildings.
22 enemy call signs were recorded. That's 22 radios. They're all concentrated in one specific place, the high-rise building district. They can't conduct active operations, but they're trying to survive thanks to supplies being delivered by air. In the vicinity of Kupyansk, particularly in the east and around Kupyansk-Uzlowy, the enemy continues to attempt attacks on Ukrainian positions, but without success. We can say with reasonable confidence that the city is under control and that the Russians have failed. In their attempts to counter the Ukrainians, Viktor Chahubov, spokesperson for the Joint Forces Group, live on the United News Marathon.
In the Lyman direction, Ukrainian soldiers repelled assaults by the invaders near the settlements of Druzhlibivka, Tverdoklebova, Drabasheva, and Stavki. On the Pokrovsk section of the front, Russian occupiers attempted to push back the defense forces in the areas of Radinske, Kotline, Udachne, Novo-Alexandrovka, and Novopavlivka, as well as near Huliaipole. Ukrainian defenders repelled an attack near Dobropilya, Preluhi, Sviatopetrivka, Zeleny, and Starokrenka.
Today, a counterattack operation is underway. The current tactical situation unfolding near Huliaipole today clearly shows significant signs of our ongoing attempt to stabilize the broader Zaporizhia frontline against further incursions. And in fact, perhaps it can be said that Ukraine... Again, I'm not getting ahead of myself because the security of the military operation being carried out today, in my opinion, today, Ukraine has at least managed to make adjustments to the conduct of the Russian Federation's Zaporizhia or Rykov offensive operation. And here, there really are 3 key points, specifically in the Sipnohorsk direction. We can say that our assault units, just like in Huliaipole, managed to push the enemy back. At some positions of ours that the Russians had already taken, we actually managed to move forward a little bit.
Partisans from the Atesh movement discovered several hundred pieces of Russian military equipment at a repair site near Jonkoy in temporarily occupied Crimea. According to agents, the Russians are actively using the camp as a logistics and repair hub. The number of vehicles fluctuates but remains consistently high. To protect against airstrikes, the Russian occupiers have brought in additional air defense and electronic warfare forces. The partisans passed all information about the location to the Ukrainian Defense Forces for further strikes. Meanwhile, in occupied Crimea, specialists from the Ukrainian Intelligence Special Unit, Primary, have destroyed Russian equipment over the past few days, worth almost $150 million. Specifically, the following were hit: a Pantsir S-1 air defense missile and gun system, a Nebo-U radar system, and an assault landing craft. And the total losses of the Russians since the start of the full-scale invasion have already exceeded 1,254,000 military personnel. Of these, 1,180 invaders were eliminated in the past 24 hours. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In addition, just yesterday, the Ukrainian Defense Forces successfully neutralized and destroyed 4 Russian tanks, 5 armored combat vehicles, and 26 separate artillery systems. They also took out an air defense system, along with 169 units of enemy automotive and special equipment.
Dmitry, well, let's try to figure this out. Indeed, President Trump in his recent statements says that Ukraine should hurry, since the Russian Federation, supposedly, is ready to sign a peace agreement and move forward in this direction. And what do we see as a result? Another night, right before the negotiations, has brought yet another barbaric, terrorist, combined missile and drone attack by the Russians. These so-called peacekeepers who claim to want peace. How can all this be explained? How can you try to explain it? Maybe there is some kind of twisted explanation for this, of course. It's just that we don't notice it, being under these attacks.
Why is that? It's all obvious. And so Russia believes that by striking Ukrainian energy facilities and infrastructure, it is strengthening its negotiating position. And, well, as for Donald Trump's statements, I think they basically fit right into this narrative as well, into the context of these kinds of ads. And generally speaking, probably.
It's not really worth taking these claims too seriously, that supposedly Ukraine should get involved or that Russia is supposedly ready to sign something, because, to put it mildly, that's just not true. And here's another point. This is certainly not the first time we have heard Donald Trump claim there is some kind of urgent deadline, insisting that a deal or document needs to be signed by Thanksgiving or perhaps by Christmas. We only have to look back at the most recent period of time to recall similar instances. But the truth of the matter is, this is not actually a one-way street. It's not just Ukraine, but also the United States. What President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, for example, talks about, like security guarantees. The arguments presented by Donald Trump might have maybe a bit more weight and significance if there were already well-defined and established security guarantees, real solid security guarantees at that, which would be formally signed and ratified regardless of the specific stance taken by the leadership in Moscow, and it is only after that process has been fully completed that there could be any form of substantive or real discussion. Right now, that's not the case, and naturally, talking about Ukraine supposedly needing to sign something, unclear, although in reality, it's all quite clear, just as you mentioned, the Russian Federation isn't changing. Its demands remain absolutely the same. Even the recent hardening of their stance is really just a return to the same talking points that were always there, just a bit in the background. So everything remains as it was before. Ukraine's capitulation, and they don't see it any other way. That's exactly why former President Donald Trump's current stance on this matter is really just insignificant background noise, and nothing more than that.
Dmitry, I wanted to ask, what do you think about this? Recently, there was a significant interview with the president of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, and he said that, in his personal opinion, in the immediate and foreseeable short-term future, as he specifically put it, there is simply no realistic reason to expect the possibility of signing a formal peace agreement anytime soon. I tend to agree with that position, but still, is it possible that something could change? If so, over what time frame? And who or what could push things forward? We understand perfectly well that for the Russian side to start considering the prospect of signing a peace agreement as a real and necessary option for them, certain conditions must be met.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And we need to pay attention to what Ukraine is saying. Ukraine is very clear that only joint pressure on the Russian Federation, a combined approach, can work. Ukraine's recent strikes on oil refineries in the territory of the Russian Federation and on its strategic infrastructure, combined with significantly heightened sanctions pressure from the United States and Europe, as well as actively establishing the specific conditions that make it absolutely impossible for the shadow tanker fleet to operate along the coasts of Europe, something Europe is more than capable of achieving right now. Legal mechanisms. In other words, measures that will lead to a lack of funds to continue the war. In addition, there must also be arms deliveries to Ukraine on a scale incomparable to what we see now, including the capability to carry out long-range strikes. This is, in fact, the single most effective and primary mechanism for fundamentally shifting the geopolitical stance of the government of the Russian Federation, so that it will actually agree to sign an agreement and stop its activities. This imitation, along with simultaneous crimes and genocide,
Let's discuss another point, Dmitry. This is both a qualitative and quantitative. The delegation in Kiev reacted reservedly to Medinsky's return. Foreign Minister Andrea Sabiha noted that Ukraine is focused on historical discussions, in other words, not on them, but on concrete results. That's why we've already heard. We understand what Medinsky is capable of. And so the upcoming round in Geneva is taking place under conditions of high tension. On the one hand, there's Ukraine's drive for practical agreements, and on the other, there are signals from Moscow about expanding their demands. It's precisely this contradiction that will determine the dynamics of further negotiations. Let's listen to the quote and come back to this.
I'll be able to comment after the meeting regarding what the arrival of this gentleman you mentioned means. But we remember very well. Previous experience shows that, as always, there will be some kind of historical pseudo-lectures recited. Ukraine doesn't need that. Andrea Sabiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
If my memory serves me right, just recently Rubio said that these historical references from Medinsky, they don't just annoy the American delegation. They actually leave them stunned. Why is Putin bringing Medinsky in again? What message is he sending, and what final goal is he pursuing at this stage? Does he want to drag things out again, negotiate, or raise the stakes? Why Medinsky dead?
Ryuta spoke about Medinsky very specifically, calling him a pseudo-historian. Of course, he is an absolutely blatant Kremlin clown, although he does hold a very specific and established position in the hierarchy. Clearly, this is a strong signal that the leadership in Moscow is not currently planning any real or meaningful agreements right now. This signal was being sent to the whole world, not just Ukraine, and honestly, it's pretty easy to read. And in this context, given the current geopolitical climate, Trump's statement that Russia is supposedly inclined to sign some kind of agreement appears to be even more peculiar and unexpected. So I can state with absolute certainty and confidence that Ukraine continues to remain absolutely constructive, because if there was any desire to drag out the negotiation process as well, or let's say to troll Moscow, then we have plenty of candidates.
Who?
Pull off that kind of story. Like Medinsky tells it, to turn a truly serious event, actual negotiations, into just a talking shop. Honestly, we've got plenty of people who could do that too. And that would be more than telling. Although, who knows, if Moscow keeps going like this, maybe that's exactly where it'll end up.
And here's another point to consider. So, as reported by the propaganda agency TASS said there were about 20 people. As a result, the Russian delegation has been expanded. And this very Russian delegation, heading to Geneva, was given clear instructions to act within the framework of the so-called Anchorage Understanding. This was stated by Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov. And what is that? What exactly is this Anchorage Understanding? And besides them, honestly, does anyone else even understand what that phrase means? Because even the Americans, who actually met with the Russians in Alaska, never used it. That particular phrase, what are they trying to say with it? What do they mean? They want to say that, essentially, they are responding to the calls from the United States, from the countries of the European continent, from all reasonable people of the world, and not responding with yet another missile or drone attack. In that sense,
these messages about the understanding of Anchorage are still being discussed. The spirit of Anchorage, I think this is a reference to Soviet-era practices. So when they talked about the spirit of something, of some negotiations, it was as if they had achieved some kind of breakthrough in talks with the United States. It was exactly those negotiations that were seen as the primary geopolitical adversary and the only truly significant second pole of global power. Now, the Russian Federation, which currently exists as, let's put it this way, definitely not like the Soviet Union, more like a third world power, but simply one that has strategic missile forces, which is why, by inertia, it continues to be perceived in a significantly more serious light than it rightfully deserves. Naturally, they are trying to bring back and revitalize those times in this particular way. They're bringing back the idea that somewhere they have their own kind of dialogue, that there's some sort of understanding. And in connection with this understanding, it's clear that in Anchorage, the American side, thank you very much. Most likely, they did not explicitly object to certain position papers that Putin himself quoted, but at the same time, they didn't express any support for them either. But in this way, by simply taking these specific actions, the Russians are trying to show that now, supposedly, they've successfully achieved something significant.